rights holders and performers for works within the UK would receive payment where currently they don't. Now, that's fine, and one would assume, therefore, that the obligations will be limited to CPTPP country rights holders and performers. But the bill, my lords, as it currently stands, bizarrely doesn't limit this extension just to CPTPP countries. Rather, it provides for secondary legislation that will in due course specify the countries to be covered. So can the Noble Lord the Minister confirm that the consultation on which countries are to be included is going to take place during the passage of this bill? And if he does, will he at least accept that we're being yet again asked to make decisions without having all the facts and certainly not knowing what the implications will be? My Lords, I hope that the Minister will make clear in his response that the Government does accept that the IP chapter of the agreement, including the suspension of some of the IP provisions, is deficient, is a real cause for concern among the creative industries, and frankly is not what the UK expects from future international trade agreements.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow Lord Foster of Bath on his very trenchant antidote to the enthusiasms we've heard for the bill and this enabling bill, and I look forward to the Minister's response on copyright. But it is also a great pleasure to welcome this bill and to welcome Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton to this House. It is indeed an honour that we have a Foreign Secretary on our benches, and it raises, as other noble lords have pointed out, the stature of the House. I met the noble Lord, Lord Cameron, before he entered Parliament. He had very kindly come to brief me on Conservative Party policy in advance of a programme I was appearing on. And in a typically courteous and patient manner, he expounded on Conservative Party policy on a range of issues, which convinced me he was very able and intellectually astute. And not only that, but he was charming and patient and courteous, and said, did I have any views on these matters? And when I gave my views, he smiled and he paused and he said, typically robust, as I would have expected from you. Well, I am delighted with his typically robust introduction of the bill and the advantages of the CPTPP, and I am truly glad that he regards this as a great opportunity for the UK, and not only its trade and the lives of its people, but that of other peoples in other parts of the world. So I am truly delighted. I welcome his analysis of the bill, which, as he explains, will ensure that the UK's legal house is in order for the CPTPP to come into operation, thus opening one of the world's fastest-growing markets to the UK people and its businesses. I have a particular interest to declare, my lords, as the founder and research director of the think tank Politaire. I have benefited and learned a great deal from working with specialist economic and trade lawyers. In particular, we have published on how best to exploit the opportunities now open to the UK for free trade since leaving the EU, and to help shape the framework for world trade in goods and services, as noble lords have already mentioned this today. Already, my lords, the CPTPP accounts for around 12% of global GDP, covering 11 countries, as your lordships have heard. And these parties are parties to the treaty. The UK will now be the 12th. That will bring the figure expected as a share of global GDP to 15%. Today, the US accounts for around 15%, as does the EU, but their shares are declining, whereas those of this region are growing. The noble lord has pointed out The proportions will be, by 2050, 25% for the CPTPP and 10% for the EU. Not only will UK businesses benefit in building their export trade, as will people themselves, from a trade deal that heralds a more competitive and wider marketplace with goods and services meeting ambitious common standards in a rules-based system. But it will also allow the UK to be a force, as noble lords have mentioned, for shaping world trade as a historic champion of free trade, a path forged globally over many centuries and for which it was known to stand and fight its corner. Good laws which were and remain clear and transparent and are enforced in our courts and elsewhere without fear or favour have allowed this country, in one major area, financial services, to overcome Amsterdam in the 17th century, yes, and Paris in the 18th in financial services, only to be rivaled today by another common law area, New York. Now, with the shift in balance of global GDP to the Indo-Pacific region, we can help shape the appetite for free trade and I hope be a force for stability and the rules-based trading system the CPTPP champions and its members do, which stretch, as we know, from Canada to Peru, Japan and Singapore to Australia and, of course, Vietnam. This bill will enable the necessary changes to UK law, and I welcome that. So all is ready for when the treaty comes into operation. The changes needed for IP, government procurement, and technical barriers to trade. Here, so the different conformity assessment bodies of the CPTPP spread across different CPTPP states will be treated on an equal footing. The impact assessment, prepared by the Department of Trade for the Delegated Powers and Reform Committee, explains that a new delegated power is envisaged for such conformity assessment bodies, and that Clause 5.3 of the bill amends the existing delegated power arrangements in Section 2064 of the Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988. The new bill gives the Secretary of State powers in Clause 2.1 to make statutory instruments to amend the subordinate legislation which places conditions on the location of the CPTDA's national treatment of conformity assessment bodies. So with respect to IP, I welcome the extension to the eligibility criteria by which performers can qualify for rights in respect of their performances in the UK. The UK welcomes talent, and the digital provisions of the CTPPP itself have been welcomed as being open and enabling by trade lawyers. It departs from the TCA, that is, the trade deal with Europe, primarily by its lighter protection of personal data in favour of free flow of data. And this is an area, my lords, which I think Britain will be instrumental in championing the reforms that are needed to meet our data protection needs. And that is another reason for bringing our influence to bear when we become the 12th member. Its modern provisions on digital trade are designed to facilitate trade, and they underscore its attention to services trade generally. On legal services, for instance, the CPTPP has been described as, by one legal authority, as amongst the most progressive trading arrangements in the world. Many of the barriers to trade in legal services are behind the border, including domestic regulations around licensing, certification, and requalification. The CPTPP specifically encourages member countries lawyers to operate on a temporary fly-in, fly-out basis and on a fully integrated basis with domestic lawyers. My Lords, before I conclude, may I trespass on your patience for a few moments to mention some of the points Viscount Trenchard would have mentioned had he not withdrawn from the debate in order to welcome the President of, be part of the group welcoming the President of the Republic of Korea. Viscount Trenchard has a particular interest in Japan and Anglo-Japanese relations. And he has asked me to mention to your lordships that not only is Japan, as you will know, the largest economy in the CPTPP, and the UK will be the second largest. Indeed, if the US had stayed the course, Viscount Trenchard suggests, our accession might not have been quite so significant for Japan as it is. He also refers to the time when Japanese friends felt a little hurt, he says, that some of us spoke as though our closest friend and partner for business and trade in Asia was China, and that the former Japanese Prime Minister felt deeply that the old and close relationship between Japan and the UK, which had been badly damaged by the events of the middle years of the century, should be restored. And his successor has played a very leading role in pushing for Britain's membership of this trade partnership. Japan has been very keen for the UK to join for geostrategic as much as for trade reasons, and was that 6 of the 11 members of the Commonwealth countries, with our accession, he says, 7 out of these. So with those wise words from Viscount Trenchard, I thank you, Lordships, for your time.
My Lords, may I add my congratulations to those of Baroness Lello and other members of Lordship's House in welcoming the Noble Lord, the Foreign Secretary, on his appointment to this House and for his maiden speech. It was an excellent speech, as anticipated. Can I also commend the fact that the Noble Lord's first public engagement was the trip to Ukraine? It was such an important signal. Like others in this House, I welcome this bill and the CPTPP agreement. It's clearly a hugely important step forward and crucial in opening up trade opportunities for British companies within significant and growing markets, which we absolutely need to do. So I congratulate the government on this agreement. My primary interest and concern lies on the potential impact the agreement could have on the agri-food sector. And I very much welcome, my Lord the Minister's reassurance that our standards will be protected within trade deals. He may recall that he and I had interaction on agricultural policy during his previous incarnation. I do appreciate the fact that to some extent I'm repeating concerns that many of us raised during the passing of the trade bill through their Lordship's House. Nevertheless, the concerns are still real, I believe, and relevant. This agreement is much better than the New Zealand and Australia deals as far as agriculture is concerned, but there are still issues of concern. My Lords, I was actively involved in the introduction of voluntary assurance standards across the agricultural sector, which is now 30 years ago, and personally helped draft the standards for beef and sheep farming. This led ultimately to full supply chain assurance and the establishment of Assured British Meat, which was chaired by the Noble Lord, the Earl of Lindsay, then eventually led to the establishment of Assured Food Standards, which still exists today and is responsible for monitoring those standards on farms. This huge voluntary initiative eventually covered all sectors of agriculture and was introduced due to a very real concern about the loss of consumer confidence through the late 1980s and early 1990s in our production systems. There was concern about the use of hormones, about sow stalls, the random use of antibiotics, and a relentless media focus on animal welfare issues, which was undermining the integrity of our production systems. There was also concern about the level of compliance with animal welfare standards, compliance with legislation, and a lack of transparency. So, my lords, we banned hormones, we banned growth promoters, banned the use of sow stalls in pig systems, we banned numerous pesticides for environmental and ecological reasons, and the majority of farmers have embraced the need for independent inspections of their farms to verify that the highest standards of animal welfare and husbandry are being practiced. We now have global leading traceability systems in agricultural production. These measures have been embraced by farmers and growers, often with huge economic consequences, and we've led the world in establishing higher standards in order to restore and maintain consumer confidence. My lords, we cannot put that investment at risk. We cannot jeopardize consumer confidence. We should not accept product from any importing country that is produced to a lower standard than is acceptable and appropriate here in our own domestic market. My lords, I can assure the House that the noble Lord Trees and I have not conferred, but I wholeheartedly support his comments. Can I also absolutely deny that what I'm suggesting is protectionism? I agree with the noble Lord Lamont on the potential benefit of free trade. British farmers are not in the least afraid to compete with any country in the world, including those included in this CPTPP agreement, provided common standards are consistently applied. I'm trying very hard, my lords, not to use the phrase level playing field. We should aspire to be a global influencer without being arrogant or complacent in helping establish international standards. Standards on the environment, on greenhouse gas emissions, on animal welfare, on food safety, that could become a meaningful foundation for global trade. We can punch above our weight, as we have done many times in the past, and have a massive influence on global standards of food production. I know that my Lord the Minister will want to reassure us that this is the government's intention and that the CPTPP agreement includes a provision that deals will conform to international standards, or internal standards, apologies. However, concerns remain about hormone-produced beef from Canada and Mexico entering our market, about the use of sow stalls, farrowing crates, tail docking in pigs, and the use of growth promoters in other countries included in the agreement. Also, the high use of antibiotics and regular application of numerous pesticides that are banned here in the UK, added to which there is a continued concern about palm oil. My lords, I don't want to sound negative, but not only have these concerns the potential to undermine our market competitiveness, but also put at risk the consumer confidence I referred to earlier, which has been hard won. Antibiotic use and certain pesticides could also have an impact on human health. I hope my Lord the Minister will be able to reassure us that rigorous auditing systems will be established to verify that equivalent standards are in place from all countries covered by this agreement. I have to advise him, however, that supply chains in many countries are nothing like as transparent as our own, and that the signing of an agreement that standards are in place is not sufficient evidence without a credible audit trail. Finally, my lords, many of us in the Chamber were successful in persuading government to put the Trade and Agriculture Commission on a permanent footing as an amendment to the Trade Bill, which was very welcome indeed. It has been established to scrutinise trade deals and for its views to be available for us to consider. And I concur with the concerns expressed by the noble Lord Kerr, on the ability of this House to scrutinise deals. It is deeply regrettable, as the noble Lord Trees and the noble Lord Foster have stated, this debate has taken place before the TAC has produced its report on the CPTPP agreement to help inform our debate today. Hopefully, we will see the report before the committee stage of this bill.
My Lords, I would like to join others in welcoming my noble friend, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, to this House. Like many others, I'm here due to him, I was a great honour of being appointed as Trade Minister. So it is very appropriate we are talking about trade, particularly as Lord Cameron was such a great proponent of trade. I joined him on many export missions around the world, and also if there was ever somebody considering investing in the UK, the Prime Minister, as he then was at the time, would always make time to see them. And the UK during that time was the #1 by a very long distance in FDI in Europe. So I thank him and welcome him. I would also like to congratulate him on his outstanding maiden speech. Not a surprise, it's almost as if he's done this sort of thing before. Turning now to this bill, it is, as many noble lords have commented, an unusual bill as it relates to technical implementation, and there's a lot of scrutiny that still hasn't happened. But I think it's important to look at the agreement as a whole and say, why does it matter? And I think, first of all, it matters, and Lord Lamont referred to this, free trade is being pushed back upon, and we have to speak up for free trade in the UK. Why is it important? Well, first of all, and the people who seem to be forgotten so often, it's good for consumers. They get more choice, they get cheaper products, competition is good for consumers. Free trade has been and is and would be and will be good for consumers. Of course, it's good for our exporters, giving them access to fast-growing markets and also inward investment. But it also raises the quality of our own industry. Exporters produce better products, they are more competitive, and when they compete against other products coming from around the world, they improve their own standards, again, to the benefit of UK productivity, something which clearly we need. And it's also important, and again, another area that often gets forgotten, in the development of countries. Whilst most countries in this agreement are pretty advanced, not all of them, any trade agreements we do around the world, and particularly we have a number in Africa, will raise the standards in these countries and also help with their development as well and maybe even better than straightforward aid. Trade and aid together make a big difference to countries. And you can see that indeed. The President of South Korea, who will be speaking here, if you look what that country has done over the last 5 decades as a result of becoming a trading powerhouse. And it's also important for international relations, this agreement. We are going to be getting closer to many countries. We have very shared and similar interests in a very important part of the world. And this particular agreement, which I'll probably call it this agreement rather than CPTPP, as most people seem to be struggling over it, no matter how many times we all try and say it. It's not the best marketing brand, I have to grant you, but this agreement, this is a good agreement. One of the things we forget is we were joining this agreement, we were acceding to it, we were not part of creating it. And actually to get such a good agreement, I think is a great credit to the Department of Business and Trade and to the civil service and the ministers involved in it. I think it's an excellent agreement. It, of course, gets a big reduction in tariffs on goods, we know that. It covers data and critically services for the UK. The UK, as has been said before, is the second largest exporter of services in the world. And it's a strength, and we have to, and it's excellent, it covers it. And also government procurement. UK government procurement has been reasonably open for some time, but not all other countries are the same. And as in one of the things, and there wasn't many I agreed with Noble Lord Foster on, rules of origin. The rules of origin rules are very helpful, particularly as you're building up supply chains through various countries, as you can see would happen with this trade agreement. It is very helpful to have cumulative rules of origin. And also technical barriers to trade are being dealt with as part of this agreement. One thing that's often not understood with trade is tariffs are frankly only part of the story. The barriers to trade in areas of conformity are very important as well, and it's excellent that this is being dealt with and hopefully be taken further from here. And it also protects UK standards. One thing we should remember, other countries look at the UK and there's certain things about what the UK produces they're also not happy about. You know, haggis is banned in the US. They think for some reason it contains things that are not healthy. It's remarkable. Marmite is banned in many countries. So whilst we'll be able to maintain our own standards, I think it's important to understand that it is not the UK only that looks at standards. And as we are doing a trade deal, of course, with countries like Australia and New Zealand and Japan, I much prefer that we're looking at maintaining standards together with them rather than necessarily doing it, for instance, with China or others doing it with China. And perhaps we're going to set a higher developed world standard than we might otherwise. And the NHS is being protected. This is a bugbear that always comes around, the accusation that NHS is going to be privatised. We've had it in every single agreement. Every agreement the UK government has been involved in, the NHS has been front and centre as it's not an area that is going to be part of the agreement, any sort of privatisation. And I remember, in fact, in negotiating TTIP as it was then, and the US government said it didn't want the NHS to be part of it. The EU said the NHS wouldn't be part of it. The UK government said they didn't want to be part of it. And every single discussion we heard, oh, the NHS is going to be part of it. The NHS is not going to be part of this either. And I'd also like to say something about ISDS, because this is something that gets a lot of criticism, like it's just a bad thing. Well, why do you have ISDS at all? It's so companies can invest in countries in the knowledge that should their domestic legislation attack them in particular, or their country in particular, they have a knowledge that they can't always, particularly in certain types of countries, rely on domestic courts to protect them. That's why you have some supranational panel. And the UK has about 90 ISDS agreements already. In UNCTAD, the UN's trade body, did a review, and between 1987 and 2020, the UK companies, 90 UK companies took action under ISDS clauses, countries outside the UK. How many were taken against the UK? 1. How many has the UK lost? None. The reason we don't lose these is actually we respect laws, we treat country favourably. It's actually why we shouldn't be that bothered about Australia and New Zealand, but there are other countries where it's more problematical. Under that UNCTAD review, Argentina has had 62 cases against it. And it has been involved in expropriating without compensation. That's the sort of thing people win cases on ISDS. There are some spurious cases in ISDS, but people tend not to win them. So just quoting cases where people have tried to take action and not won them is not sufficient. And so I'm a big supporter of ISDS, and I think it's good we've got it, particularly a modern ISDS clause. Look, we know this is not a replacement for the single market, and it's a bit of a spurious discussion. Of course, it's not as big as not as good, but it's pointless. If you look at the countries we might want to do trade agreements with, the US has put up the close sign on trade deals with anyone. I think that is a great pity and a great failure of the US, but it is about the one bipartisan thing you will see in the US. They don't want to do trade agreements. China we'll talk about later, it's got particular issues, and India will be a slow process. Of course we'd like one with India. So basically we're hitting most of the next tier of countries, Japan and Canada, for example. Now, we may only be forecasting a relatively small enhancement to GDP, but I'd say to noble members, if they use the phrase only followed by a number that's got billions in it, they've got to be a little bit careful. It is worth billions. And these forecasts are based on relatively static assumptions. And our real focus should be is how can we get more from this agreement than these static assumptions would say. And we have the President of South Korea not far from here, or he was earlier, and it's worth reflecting on the agreement with them. We did a trade agreement with them, it was under, in fact, the Prime Minister between the EU and South Korea in about 2011, I think. And since then, our trade with South Korea has gone up by a factor of roughly 3 times. So it can make an enormous difference. But what you need to do is the government focus on it. Doing this agreement, with all its imperfections or perfections, with however you debate it, is really only a very small part of what we need to do. We need to do 2 things. The first of these is a proper activation programme for the government. It's what you would do in business. You'd say, I've got an agreement, now how do we take advantage of it? We need a UK education programme. The FSB, in giving evidence to the International Agreement Select Committee, highlighted that small companies just don't know about trade agreements, and they just don't know about the opportunities from them, and we have to get out to see them. UK medium-sized companies are also, they're laggards. When I was Trade Minister, I remember that only 1 in 6 UK companies, medium-sized companies, exported outside the EU. Now, you may say, oh, well, that was something to do with the EU. Well, it was 1 in 4 in Germany, and even more shockingly, 1 in 3 in Italy. So UK medium-sized companies need to be helped. The big companies can generally do their own thing. Generally, businesses are also not aware of what's on offer from the government. And the government provides a lot of help and support, but they don't make them aware. It was a failure in my time, and it remains a failure. We need to make sure there's sufficient trade staff at our embassies and consuls. We need to ensure that there are government-supported trade trips to these countries in the sectors that are really important. So decide what they are and have a focused thing. I'd like to hear the Minister talk about that later. We need support for trade shows. We need it year after year after year, not just once. And the trade envoys, my old friend Lord Marlin talked about them and setting up, have done a tremendous job, and we need to take and reinforce their work in these countries. And remember that trade is not just for the Department of Business and Trade, it's also a pan-government effort. So we need, for example, the Ministry of Justice to be pushing legal services. We need the Treasury to be pushing financial services. We need DEFRA, of course, to be pushing food exports. Although I would say perhaps we should steer clear of too many speeches about cheese, as they have not always gone well. Inward investment efforts. Also, we have to ensure that we put a lot of efforts to attract inward investment from these countries. Canada and Australia pension funds are 2 of our biggest inward investors. We have to do more. It's a multi-year effort, and we need to move forward with that, with consistency. And I'd like my friend the Minister to talk about whether they will be setting some targets as to how much we can do both for FDI and exports. I finally end, and I know I've taken up too much time, we need to also strive to make this agreement wider and deeper. We need to work with more countries. China's been talked about. It should be remembered that this agreement has 4 of the 5 I countries, or 8 out of the 10 I's, you might call it. And together with Japan, I suspect we'll have similar interests about the role of China. But there's many other countries interested in joining. We've got to work more on services. We've got to do more on product conformity. So I hope this enabling bill will move swiftly through the House and we can get onto the important things. My Lords, we don't know what the ceiling of what can be achieved with this, but we will be better as a country if we look outwards and upwards rather than downwards, backwards and inwards. Thank you.
My Lords, I join many others in offering the Green Group's welcome to the Noble Lord, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, and take a moment to reflect on the last time I was sharing a platform with our new Foreign Secretary. The Noble Lord might recall that it was at the Oval Cricket Ground in 2016. The Noble Lord was standing in front of a blue Mini, Harriet Harman was standing in front of a red Mini, Tim Farron was standing in front of a yellow Mini, and I was standing in front of a green Brompton bicycle. The Noble Lord might take that as a lesson from what to expect from the Green scrutiny on foreign issues. We take a different approach, offer fresh new perspectives. The Green Party is the future. And in reflecting on that, I would respectfully disagree with the Noble Lord, Lord Lamont of Lowick. Ideas from the past, ideas of the 19th and 20th century, about free trade, about the desirability of more and more trade, are ideas that have gravely depleted our planet, heated our climate, and inflicted human rights abuses, poverty, and suffering on vulnerable communities and individuals, particularly women and Indigenous people. The Noble Lord, Lord Lamont, counted the pounds in saying that the policy of self-sufficiency comes at a price. I would point out that the policy of free trade at all costs has come perilously close to costing us the earth and done huge damage to the health and well-being of billions of human beings. Further, we're now in the age of shocks. I've noticed over my 4 years in your Lordship's house that fewer and fewer people talk about going back to normal, some age presumably before the 2007 and 8 financial crash. Global, complex, just-in-time supply chains have gone out of fashion for good reason. Instead of chasing maximum profits, an extra halfpenny here if an item is shipped around the world for one bit of processing, then shipped back again, companies are focusing increasingly on resilience. And so should, particularly when it comes to food, governments, both in their own actions and in their policies. Just as rather than focusing on growth at all costs, they need to focus on security. Now, to come to some specific elements of the CPTPP, I'll start with a point strongly made by the Noble Lord Collins of Highbury about the ISDS, also known as the secret courts, the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Procedure. And I go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which last year said that this presented a huge risk to essential action on the climate. A study in the journal Science found that governments could be liable for up to $340 billion of payouts through ISDS if they take essential environmental measures that we need to keep us all safe. High-profile cases have seen governments challenged by private investors over a phase-out of coal-fired power, bans on offshore exploitation of oil and gas, and moves to strengthen environmental assessments. And I would pick up, in reference to the comments of the Noble Lord, Lord Livingston, that taking cases, dragging through the ISD process over years at huge cost, has what the IPCC and others have identified has a chilling effect on governments taking action, whatever the final outcome of the case years and many millions of pounds or dollars later. This has an impact. Now, the UK has agreed side letters with CPTPP members Australia and New Zealand to disapply the provisions of the secret courts. The key question really is, and this is the direct question I'm going to put to the Noble Lord, Lord Johnson, Canada is a particular concern. Canadian companies have been particularly litigious, having brought 65 ISDS cases, and this could have a profound negative impact on the UK's right to democratically regulate our own conditions. In October, there was a letter sent by 30 NGOs and trade unions and 50 professionals from both the UK and Canada calling for an immediate negotiation for a side letter. Is this something the government will at least consider, given the Canadian track record? I want to come also to pick up on the points raised by the Noble Lord, Lord Curry of Kirkale. And I speak now as a former resident of Thailand with some awareness of the environmental conditions and the farming conditions in Southeast Asia. And the fact is, when we look across all of the CPTPP countries, 119 pesticides that are banned in the UK are allowed for use in one or more of the group's members. Many of these countries will be keen to export agri-food products to the UK. And as the Noble Lord, Lord Curry said, this has real risks of further undermining our farmers after the potentially disastrous impacts of the Australia and New Zealand deals. And of course, there's going to be huge pressure again in Canada, where they use hormone-treated beef, something that, as the Noble Lord said, there's huge public concern about in the UK for good reason. I also want to pick up a point raised by the Noble Lord, Lord Collins, about the issue of the end of the tariff of palm oils in Malaysia. Now, the Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, said in March, in the context of the CPTPP, that palm oil was, quote, a great product. Well, not, I'm afraid, if you're an orangutan, a member of a critically endangered species of our close relatives who have seen their homes destroyed, once biodiverse, rich forests storing masses of carbon turned into serried ranks of sterile plantations. Or, indeed, if you're a consumer of much of that palm oil and the ultra-processed products, the damage from which is being set out right at this moment upstairs, as the All-Party Parliamentary Food and Health Forum hears from Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, the author of the best-selling book, Ultra-Processed People, which pretty well describes our current diet, and we certainly don't want to make it worse. Finally, I want to quote the very useful Trade Justice Movement briefing for today's debate, that this is an important opportunity for parliamentarians to debate the flaws in the UK's trade scrutiny process, and to highlight, as the Noble Lord Lord Razzle did, that using, I'd call it whiteout, possibly that's an Australianism, I'm not sure, using whiteout on scores of documents to replace the EU with the UK does not amount to a benefit of Brexit. And, as I often say, democracy, it would be a good idea. And as the Noble Lord Lord Kerr highlighted, the opportunities for democratic oversight of this government's trade policies are severely lacking. We've got to take what opportunities we can to hold the government to account on many issues, not least our relationship with the rest of the world. I finish by promising the Noble Lord Lord Cameron that I will be doing that particularly on the development part of his portfolio, which the Noble Lord, as Prime Minister, did have a positive record, as he did on the subject of antimicrobial resistance. I'll remind the Noble Lord that as we learnt through COVID, that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Antimicrobial resistance is very much an issue that's in our interest to tackle all around the world.
Well done, well done.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to take part in this debate. In doing so, I declare my financial services and technology interests in Boston Limited and EcoSpend Limited, respectively. And it's more than a pleasure to welcome my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, to the front bench in his new role. I was fortunate enough to work with the then Prime Minister in the run-up to and during the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games, where he was incredibly supportive to the extent that on International Paralympic Day, at a year to go to the opening ceremony of the Games, he agreed to play in the centre of Trafalgar Square a game of tennis against the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. I won't trouble the House with who was the victor of that particular sporting clash of titans, but the sotto voce classical cursing which I think was taking place, I did fear at any point either player might pull their Achilles. But his support, particularly for the Paralympic Games, enabled us in the summer of 2012 to put on not just such a golden summer of sport, but to do something which fundamentally changed attitudes and created opportunities for disabled people in a way that hasn't been rivalled since, and that was so much to do with his leadership as Prime Minister at that stage. My Lords, I'd like to touch on 4 areas of inward investment, the role of our regulators, how we look at the IP issues, and also looking at the broader geopolitical elements of this agreement. Firstly, to take a step back, there could be barely a more appropriate time to look at this agreement as in the year of the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith, because we need to review and reconsider the wealth of nations and how we take a broad and also deep view of wealth to ensure that we have a group of trading nations which truly delivers for all citizens economic, social, psychological benefits. We've never been more connected, seldom off our screens, so-called social media taking up so much of our times, never been more connected, and yet we see so many issues of retreatism, populism, nationalism, rather than the pressing need to come together to get after so many of the existential challenges which we now face. In essence, all of the significant challenges are global in nature. If we wanted to recast ESG, we should really see it as existential, seismic, and global. So this agreement comes at the right time and has so much potentially to offer in bringing nations together
to solve some of the greatest challenges of any time, never mind just our time. Can I ask the Minister, when he comes to respond, to say something on the government's approach to inward investment? Because I believe we really need to consider that welcome mat that we need to lay down. When people seek to invest in this nation, they need to know so much about the intricacies, the details of so many multiple factors. Would my noble friend the Minister not agree that it would make sense if we had a specific team in the department to deal with this issue, so we really enable such a welcome mat in real time, all that information, to ensure that we optimise the inward investment that we can pull in. Turning to the role of our regulators, not just our financial services regulators, but all relevant regulators associated with this agreement. Would my noble friend the Minister not agree that the regulators have a role to connect internationally, to do everything they can to potentially increase trade between all the nations within this agreement as currently set out? The agreement talks about prioritising digital services, and rightly it should. The great potential of so much in digital is that barriers to entry for new entrants are so low. You can potentially run a global business from your bedroom with a laptop and a decent broadband connection. Would my noble friend say something about how the government seeks to progress what we were able to push through with the Electronic Trade Documents Act? It was a small act. I was fortunate enough to be a member of the Special Bill Committee, and I've often described it as the most significant law that no one has ever heard of. And it is the most significant law because I think it's the first time that the UK Parliament, it's the first time that any Parliament has legislated for the opportunities of these new technologies, tied with our financial services ecosystem and the extraordinary good fortune of English common law, used in so many jurisdictions around the world because of its certainty and its flexibility and ability to develop through precedent and case law. Passing the law was significant, but would my noble friend and Minister, in concluding, say something on how we can connect with all the nations in this agreement to enable all of our learnings from passing the ETDA to be shared so nations, other jurisdictions can pass similar legislation, because, as we know, it takes two to trade. To enable physical documents to be held in electronic format and to have the physical goods, all of the customs and legal documentation and all of the financials combined in real time is nothing short of transformational when it comes to international trade, enabling transfer of title to melt from between 10 to 14 days into mere moments. That's a way to transform trade. And I believe this agreement is a good opportunity to parlay with those nations to convey the benefits of passing similar electronic trade document legislation in their jurisdictions. Turning to IP, there's a lot in the agreement concerning IP and copyright, but can I ask specifically the Minister, when he comes to wind up, as currently drafted, does the agreement offer equal rights for UK performers to assert their copyright and other IP rights in other nations, as it does for internationals to assert such rights in the UK? I'm not sure it's entirely clear in the current draft. In conclusion, my Lords, I support this agreement. In terms of international agreements, it certainly makes the heaviest use of the letter P, but it is none the worse for that. As other noble lords have mentioned, we've had extraordinarily impactful international agreements in the past, and they've served us well, but many of them are well in the past in terms of their formulation and their construction. It seems an opportune moment to review all of these agreements to see how we can achieve the optimum for nations, for citizens, for all people around the world, because the challenges are global and we can only solve them if we work together collaboratively, truly connected, using all of our good offices, all that we've learned in the UK, connecting with all of our global friends so we can all move forward and truly deliver on wealth in the deepest, broadest sense for all nations.
Hear, hear.
The Noble Lord Kerr referred to the lack of a published trade strategy by this and former administrations. I'm delighted he did so, as many times over I've attempted to have government, at the very least, publish quarterly regional trade commissioner reports that would go a long way to assist an understanding of the opportunities and challenges that exist in any particular region. My Lords, CPTPP is rightly a cornerstone of UK's global trade strategy and serve useful as a prompt to be replicated with equal vigour with the important EU relationship building exercise. Benefits for CPTP accession, my Lords, can be readily identified. Yes, but with qualification to access to dynamic new markets. Yes to groundbreaking digital and data provisions. Yes to tariff reductions on goods. And yes to supply chain diversification, for example. However, when scrutinised, an immediate boost for UK exports for the UK by CPTPP membership is not so immediately apparent, given that much of UK services exports already are to 4 major CPTPP members, and the UK having bilateral FTAs with 3 others. My Lords, I should state before continuing that I've never had any dealings with China and do not expect to do so. The noble Baroness, Lady Hayter, said the question of China is of central importance. But it is to the future that substantial gains could come, however, should future CPTPP expansion include China. I do recognise that for the UK that could present dilemmas on geopolitical grounds, human rights and China's economic system, with prolonged accession negotiations having consequential delay for others waiting in line to join. My view is that participation would be a good thing for China, leading to domestic reform, strengthening its role in the global supply chain cycle, in addition to creating a more stable and open regional investment environment with the additional benefits that derive from closer partnership with the family of nations. That is important to us all. Let there be no doubt that China would have to be fully compliant with all the terms and conditions as set out under the terms before us. But better China be de-risked without constant belligerence and be at the table. And there are, after all, many shared experiences that both the UK and China could work together. The UK wrote a chapter of history with our past, and without wishing to be perceived as overly self-critical and accused of double standards, ensuring others consider history and lessons learned is something from which we could all benefit, including China. China's strategy and practices towards Africa, Sri Lanka, and more latterly the Solomon Islands are examples. My Lords, the UK should not be caught out on a limb. The government has a well-rehearsed backwards and forwards series of strategies over China, which include geopolitical and human rights challenges, with some suggesting that the government might frustrate China's CPTPP accession aspirations. There are, however, many in and from China, who view the state of the world and who believe China may be on the verge of adjusting policies more favourably towards the West. This shift of tides can be felt internally, with indications that China is showing more interest in its bid for CPTPP membership and does not wish to be left behind by major trading partners, and recognising that its bid will require policy changes. This should be encouraged. It is right, however, that the UK be promoting a regional vision focusing on an open and rules-based trading system, but in lockstep with our economic security. There are many in China of the view that the UK is a country with influence with other stakeholders, such as Japan. It should be remembered that President Xi's pursued improved relations with Japan's Prime Minister Kishida, placing emphasis on shared economic interests and giving rise to hope that China might be preparing for a degree of flexibility in its talks on CPTPP membership. That preceded the more recent, equally positive meeting with President Biden in San Francisco. I suggest that we all watch with keen interest what transpires from the upcoming EU-China summit. We live in a complex world, my lords, with world powers not being currently aligned on many values. And whilst ideological change can be a long journey for the UK and US, by contrast, China's power structure can allow for change to happen more quickly. It will be hard for some, but the UK should not be blind to a policy reset and recognise that a byproduct of peace and coexistence is international trade. And as the noble Lord Howell has pointed out, it is all about diplomacy and tolerance. That is surely why we are gathered here today, my lords.
My lords, can I add my words to congratulate Lord Cameron on taking on the role of Foreign Secretary. Don't let us ever underestimate overseas governments. They know who has influence and who hasn't in foreign affairs, and they know when they are meeting somebody who has got influence in this country and influence overseas. So it is really great news. I've also had a lot of opportunities to see Lord Johnson at work on the investment side, and I can tell you it is mightily impressive. I welcome this second reading of the bill, as the CPTPP provides the UK with a truly unrivalled opportunity to deepen our economic ties with some of the world's most dynamic and progressive economies. And I am, like others here, a true believer in free trade. And therefore, I have had a lot of excitement, and I use that word, excitement, following the succession of the CPTPP as it's progressed through your Lordship's International Agreements Committee, and Lord Goldsmith has gone into that in some detail. But there are a couple of points I want to particularly pull out. I think we need, and I welcome, clarity on rules of origin, specifically in areas where the existing FTAs are in place, so that UK businesses can more easily ascertain whether there would be more benefit in them trading under localised bilateral agreements or by the CPTPP itself. Further to this, I highlighted that the government needed to take bolder action in securing more generous local content thresholds in order to protect UK manufacturers. And I would be grateful if the Minister could provide some reassurances that mitigating the concerns from industry in these important areas remains a priority for this government as this bill progresses. My Lords, by fostering an environment of free and open trade, the CPTPP promotes economic growth and encourages innovation, benefiting UK businesses, both large and small. The CPTPP opens doors for collaboration in areas important to the UK economy, such as innovation, technology and research. through connecting with economies who are today at the forefront of technological advancement. It is my hope that the CPTPP will allow the UK to stimulate innovation, create high-skilled jobs, and allow us to remain a competitive force within the global marketplace. Picking up on conformity assessments, I am pleased that the bill, my lords, will enhance regulatory cooperation between the UK and other countries. For trade agreements of any kind are pointless if they do not seek to reduce costs and bureaucracy for our domestic businesses at every possible opportunity. And we've touched a little bit on consumer rights. It is, of course, important to acknowledge that we are ceding to an existing agreement, as many people have made this point, that government was indeed limited in seeking the types of amendments that some would have. I, for one, remain entirely satisfied that the government has proven that it remains committed to ensuring our high standards, protections, and the rights of the consumer will be safeguarded in this agreement. I would, however, urge government, my lords, to seek further joint statements on a bilateral basis, such as the joint statement on sustainable agricultural commodity trade in Malaysia, to demonstrate that the United Kingdom's reputation as a socially responsible and forward-thinking trading partner remains intact. Now, that's all the good stuff. Now, if I may, a little bit of criticism. And Lord Goldsmith did pick up on this. We live in an era where technology is advancing at an unprecedented rate, in which business needs quick access to the latest information for trade. It is therefore disappointing that our own government website, GovUK, falls well short in providing easy, accessible trade-related information. Yeah. My request to Lord Johnson, and it's summing up, is that he will get his department to ensure that our website equals the gold standards of other countries. Lord Prost, I'm sure, will not be happy to hear this, that even the EU is better than the UK at this. But the gold standard seems to be accepted as being Australia. Trade agreements are absolutely pointless. And if business isn't able to go through the door and trade, it must be easy to trade, it must be easy to get information, and it is essential for SMEs that this is the case. So I think it's a real plea here that we make sure that all the information we need is accessible, easily accessible, and understandable. And as we attempt to navigate the choppy waters of international affairs and the increasing complexities of global trade, it is an increasingly dangerous world. It is important to acknowledge the strategic importance of this accession to this agreement. While by the government's own assessment, the economic benefits of the UK accession will initially be small, our accession to the CPTPP signals our long overdue tilt to the Asia-Pacific region, and my view the starting point of forging stronger bilateral economic and security ties with other major economies, Japan, Canada, Australia and others. My lords, for the United Kingdom, the CPTPP ensures that our businesses will have increased access to markets that were previously characterised by high tariff barriers, by reducing these barriers, promoting regulatory cooperation, and leading the CPTPP nations in promoting innovation and sustainability. Our accession offers a significant opportunity for this country. I therefore very much support what I believe to be a very exciting journey that we're on.
Yeah.
I begin by joining with others to welcome the Noble Lord, the Secretary of State, to his new position and congratulate him on his maiden speech. His standing can only enhance the reputation of your Lordship's house. This trade agreement is one of the residues left from the Department of International Trade, now disbanded and currently within the Department for Business. The Trade Department could well have been characterised then as being rather reticent to stand up for international UK interests, especially of British livelihoods and prevailing standards, which all domestic production must adhere to. It seemed to rush through deals with all countries that trade with the UK and persisted in maintaining the rather extraordinary executive principle and stuck to the CRAG process of endorsing trade deals originally set up pre-Brexit, when authority and jurisdiction ultimately rested within the EU. The noble Lord Frost is correct in his assessment of the continuing appropriateness of the CRAG process. What prominence does international trade now have within the wider business department, with what budget and headcount? I join with others calling on the noble Lord the Secretary of State to outline the timetable and process in the ratification schedule your Lordship's House will have following this legislation. As well as being opaque, the CRAG process only allows for a vote in the Commons following a debate outlining specific concerns. Will the government mirror this process at least in your Lordship's House? I thank your Lordship's Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee report on the bill and ask that the Secretary of State replies further to these technical issues. The Department's impact assessment does not seem to examine critically the effects of this trade deal with existing trade with others, most notably in members of the Commonwealth, 7 of whose members are in this agreement. In that regard, the comments of the noble Lord Marland were well made. The UK has concluded a side letter with Australia and now New Zealand as CPTPP parties to disapply these provisions. What percentage of the estimated benefits from concluding the deal will now no longer apply? Of course, the UK has concluded a separate, possibly damaging, one-sided trade deal with both Australia and New Zealand. Does this and other agreements rather undermine the merits of this treaty? Will this lead towards preference access arrangements being eroded on certain foods, such as bananas, vital to the interests of certain Commonwealth countries? Certain other provisions, such as investor-state dispute settlement provisions, has also raised alarm. Can the noble Lord the Secretary of State commit the government to seek a side letter with Canada to disapply the use of such provisions between Canada and the UK and maintain the UK's right to regulate in the UK's public interest? When the House previously debated this agreement following ministerial statements, many questions were asked around the potential membership of China. Can the noble Lord the Secretary of State expand on the process that China would need to follow and what procedures exist for the UK to take a full role to veto, if such is required, of such an application, should it still be necessary to safeguard the integrity of existing relationships? Australia has already said it would not endorse China's application while China continues to block the import of Australian goods. On one of these previous occasions, I asked the then Minister, not the noble Lord Grimstone, I hasten to add, the then Minister, would the government give a commitment to safeguard trade with Taiwan? As the Secretary of State will know, the UK has an enhanced trade partnership ETP arrangement with Taiwan. I cannot say that my confidence was raised from the reply. Taiwan is indeed one of the most advanced in its innovation and skills in the technology and communication sector. Can I ask the Secretary of State to give the House the confidence now that the UK will continue to support the continuing independence of Taiwan from interference from China and safeguard present and future trade with Taiwan in all circumstances? What effect will the CPTPP have on trade with Taiwan? The Secretary of State, in his opening remarks, made great emphasis that UK standards would be maintained across all food animal welfare and environmental conditions. Here I declare my interest as having a dairy farm still receiving some residues of payments under the basic payment scheme. I don't entirely share the continuing endorsements that standard will still be maintained when all ministers repeat this mantra rather too glibly. As my noble friend the Shadow Minister asked, what safeguards will there be to follow up on these statements? The government has already resisted amendments to underpin this commitment on a statutory basis, insisting present agencies, such as the Food Standards Agency, exist for this purpose. During the passage of the Trade Bill Now Act, the government did concede the appointment of a Trade and Agriculture Commission, proposed by the Noble Lord Currie, who spoke well about this in his remarks. However, the then Secretary of State only requested advice from the TAC in mid-July this year. The TAC calls for evidence only concluded in mid-August, and its report on this trade deal has yet to be published. This report will be important for your Lordship's House to consider carefully. Will the Noble Lord the Secretary of State commit to reply to that report, publish it immediately, and most notably be available to this House to study during the passage of the committee stage to inform our deliberations? As has been noted, your Lordship's International Agreements Committee has also an ongoing inquiry. Surely it is important that all these committees and agencies should be engaged in the process before the government fully endorses any trade deal. Full transparency of all evidence and effects are paramount in all legislation and should be included in all impact assessments. In this regard, the geographical indicators provisions in the agreement are very important and have some alarm attached with them. Is there any independent inspection regime that will be conducting investigations on the various countries party to the deal? Will the UK only rely on the exporting countries' institutions to undertake certification of standards? Will any authority in this country be set up to assess these agencies for recognition and be able to inspect and assess the relevant countries' assessments of their standards, and that these are necessarily sufficient and accurate? How would such arrangements work? In this, I recognise the lengths that the EU pursues in their assessment of standards that would be needed to qualify access in the EU. What powers would the Food Standards Agency have once a complaint was received to an imported product? And I'm grateful to the Noble Lord Trees for his remarks made on this point. What protections will be written into the final agreement that no divergence of supplies from countries such as China outside of this agreement can be rerouted to the UK via such intermediaries such as Vietnam? There are still many concerns to be addressed. In concluding, I welcome all opportunities to increase trade and any advantages that this country can gain through exports and improving the choice and quality of goods that can be imported into this country. However, let's get the process right and let's be sustainable. The terms of trade must be beneficial and allow for greater prosperity for everyone, including our footprint on the planet. The Business and Trade Department needs to enhance present support for business to secure these benefits, and that includes agriculture.
My Lords, I'd like to congratulate the Noble Lord, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, on his excellent maiden speech. I'm speaking at second reading because I support this bill and the sensible changes it makes to our domestic laws, which will enable us to take full advantage of this agreement. I'm particularly keen to talk about the benefits to our SMEs, both exporters and importers, how it will enhance our trading relationship with Peru, and the multiple ancillary benefits to the wider UK community. I refer the House to my entry in the Register of Interests. Prior to having the honour and privilege of joining your Lordship's House, I spent over 20 years advising and winning business from around a third of the companies in the FTSE 100. I greatly enjoyed my trips to Derby to see Rolls-Royce and Farnborough to see BAE, two of our leading UK exporters. For the past few years, my attention has migrated to SMEs, and it is this focus which has made me realise that whilst our large listed businesses, of course, make amazing contributions to both the economy and employment, SMEs are the lifeblood of our nation. I speak on a daily basis to these firms, and I am constantly dazzled by their entrepreneurial spirit, their determination, their grit, and their ability to innovate and adapt on what can often be a very bumpy ride. It is these enterprises who will hopefully grow to be the future Rolls-Royces and BAEs, and we should be doing everything we can to support them. I believe this bill and the agreement behind it aim to achieve that. I know my noble friend the Minister, Lord Johnston of Lainston, enjoys statistics, so please allow me to share some. UK exports are now at the highest level we have seen in our history, 882 billion sterling year on year as of September 2023. The government's strategy is to achieve 1 trillion sterling of exports by 2030, so we are comfortably on track to exceed that target. In 2023, 84% of the businesses directly supported by our excellent UK export finance team, some 529 companies, were SMEs. This is the highest annual figure on record and represents a steady uptrend in UK export finance's support for SMEs since 2019. These numbers are significant and ones to be proud of, but I would like to give you what I believe is the most important statistic of them all. If you were to go to Companies House today, you would find around 5.4 million firms registered. Of those 5.4 million, my lords, only 8.8% of them export at all. Through this bill and agreement, we have an opportunity to increase that number significantly. Because we are starting from a low base, it is much easier to incrementally grow that 8.8% to say 20% and higher in the longer term. This will deliver major benefits both to the UK economy and the workforce. CPTPP membership will give us access to 15% of global GDP, access to some of the world's most material markets in the Americas and Asia Pacific. My lords, I can only see upside to helping our great UK companies export, and this bill and agreement will play an important part in that. The Institute of Directors' feedback on the bill was, and I quote, "Anything that makes it easier for British businesses to export is good news." I should also flag the benefits to our importers. Only a few weeks ago, I was speaking to a business owner who is investigating how to import chemicals from one of the CPTPP countries to manufacture his product in the UK. He needs to diversify his supplier base, and this bill will help give him greater access to the global supply chain. And finally, my lords, due to my involvement with Peru, allow me to give you some examples of how both the UK and Peru will benefit from this agreement. Tariffs of 11% will be eliminated on UK exports of beef. Tariffs of mostly 6% will be eliminated on UK exports of poultry, whilst at the same time, we in the UK can take advantage of cheaper import prices for Peru's incredible and diverse array of fresh fruit and juices, which I personally enjoy, as well as chemical and manufacturing inputs, to name but a few. UK business visitors will enjoy an extended length of stay in Peru, and we will enjoy greater transparency for British investors in Peruvian companies and their directors. Our exports to Peru were 370 million sterling in 2022. That represented a 46% increase year on year, and there is no reason we cannot continue to grow strongly. I hope as part of the CPTPP, we will expand and continue to work together in sectors such as mining, energy, finance and tourism. My lords, I truly believe we have an opportunity here to help our FTSE and AIM companies, our SMEs, our exporters, our importers, to create large amounts of new UK jobs over time and work collaboratively with our partners in the CPTPP so everyone benefits.
Yeah.
My Lords, trade has always been a subtle and underrated form of foreign policy. And before he leaves, may I welcome the new Foreign Secretary to this House and to this debate, and to wish him well, because he's just returned from Ukraine. And I'm hoping that as a byproduct of the war with Russia, this government will work closer to Europe, not only in defence, but in trade and in international development. My Lords, I recognise this legislation is technical, but like others, I have questions about where the bill fits within the UK's trade scrutiny policies, and I wish to seek clarity on certain aspects of the agreement. I particularly acknowledge the help of the trade justice movement. My Lords, it's nearly a year since I left the committee, but I well remember our first meetings with the Minister, very friendly, chaired by the Noble Baroness, Lady Hayter, and I'm glad to see her and Lord Goldsmith back here again today. I also welcome back the Trade Minister himself as one of the government's survivors from the last 12 months. Today, I shall take him back to some of our previous conversations about scrutiny, about deforestation, and about food standards. And I must also say that we all miss the unique personality of the late noble and learned Lord Morris, who was nothing less than a stalwart on the subject of agriculture, and especially the too often ignored interests of the Welsh uplands. With regard to scrutiny, I regret that the Crag process by which CPTPP and other trade treaties are ratified remains unfit for purpose, as others have said. Parliament should have more input into shaping the UK's negotiating objectives and to have sight of the negotiating text as talks progress. That's important behind-the-scenes business. There is international precedent for this in the US Congress. And I agree with my noble friend, Lord Kerr, that we do need to have a debate on trade strategy. I think that point has been made already. I understand that accession to CPTPP is a little different from the negotiation of a new trade treaty, but increased scrutiny would improve and not hinder our trade outcomes. Red lines established by Parliament could strengthen the hands of negotiators. So I hope the Minister will give us some reassurance that there will be a vote on a substantive motion on accession, and it will be held in another place during the Crag period. And there's also, as Lord Foster said, a procedural question regarding the timing. Given that Crag has not yet commenced, we're debating legislation that implements an agreement to which Parliament has not yet consented and on which the committee is still taking evidence. It doesn't have to be like this. Isn't it rather illogical? And can the Minister explain why the government has introduced this bill so far ahead of Crag? It could have been the other way around. On NGOs, the Minister may recall his response to a written question he gave me in July. The Department had carried out one of the most thorough consultation exercises ever. But this is not the story I hear from the NGOs. They refer to the systems set up originally by the DIT to generate dialogue, such as the trade advisory groups or the tags, which are still not working properly. Would the Minister agree that these systems must be improved if we're going to have the opinion from outside? And on specific aspects, there is still widespread concern about the effect of reduced tariffs, for example, on expanding palm oil imports leading to deforestation. Lady Bennett has mentioned this. This is occurring in several member states, notably Indonesia and Malaysia. I have read the joint declaration on sustainable agriculture with Malaysia, which is obviously, at least potentially, a notable advance, and I expect the Minister will mention that. I've also read the impact assessment, which says the agreement is not expected to have a significant impact on wider environmental issues, such as diversity and deforestation. But it admits that Malaysia has suffered a 29% fall in tree cover over the last 20 years. That's a huge percentage, owing to agricultural commodities like palm oil and, of course, international trade. But can the Minister explain how the Department can monitor British companies and the many supply chains which are engaged in these giant operations? Does he know of companies practicing due diligence in the CPTPP countries? Again, it may be an unequal agreement. Is this an area where government should be working more closely with the local NGOs in the countries concerned, like Malaysia, which often have the experience on the ground and the capacity to work in partnership? As for food standards, we shall have to wait for the TAC and the FSA, and I don't envy them examining so many countries. Lord Trees has mentioned veterinary standards. Lord Curry and Lady Bennett mentioned divergent standards on pesticides. Is the government concerned that other member states will gain a competitive advantage from these divergences? And Lord Collins mentioned early on there's also deep disquiet in Canada from the Canadian meat industry regarding the UK's regulations on hormone-treated beef. What are the prospects of the UK making concessions in this area? And turning to human rights, I heard the new Foreign Secretary's reassurance, but I have to take the Minister back again to the India Free Trade Agreement on which the committee took evidence during the previous year. We had an interesting session with the department's negotiating team, and I vividly recall the lead negotiator's attitude to human rights. It was simple. This agreement is about trade, not about human rights. Human rights just wasn't in his vocabulary. He was a negotiator. I don't think he had even read the impact assessment. My Lords, in case this negotiator is still representing the UK, I think I must repeat what some of us said at the time, that trade is not just about finance and investment. It is a relationship between states based on a range of criteria such as climate standards and moral values. And these issues are constantly discussed between friends. They are important even when the UK economy badly needs, as we know it does, support from trade agreements such as CPTPP, and they are not in contradiction with one another. My Lords, finally, there was a joint statement with 5 members of the CPTPP on July the 16th on the environment and sustainable development. It ignored human rights. It did mention labour rights and indigenous rights in passing, but nothing about governance or the rule of law, let alone supply chains and minority rights. So, my Lords, I think there's a lot to catch up with, and we look forward to many stages of this bill and subsequent debate. I thank the Minister for his listening powers, and I look forward to his answers to at least some of the questions.
My Lords, firstly an apology that I was required in other meetings for much of the afternoon, so I look forward to reading many of the contributions, but I did have the pleasure of hearing my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, and the opening speeches. 34 years since my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, and I first started to work together, and I'm looking forward to resuming the pleasure of working with him in this House. Can I say first, one of his actions as Prime Minister was to nominate me to chair of the UK-Japan 21st Century Group, so I declare my registered interest as co-chair of that group. While I was listening to my noble friend Lord Lamont, happily I thought I can reduce the scope of my speech by saying I simply agree with him about the necessary benefits, the benefits that accrue to this country from free trade agreements, of which this is one, of the particular benefits associated with the opportunities in such a fast-growing part of the world in terms of services trade and digital trade. The CPTPP is the most advanced regional agreement on digital trade, but other countries within it with whom we have bilateral agreements like Singapore give us hope that CPTPP will be once more a leader in developing digital trade, and I very much look forward to that. And that will no doubt be even more advanced if we were to bring Korea into the CPTPP in future, and with the President of the Republic of Korea here today, I'm sure that will have featured in our discussions. So I'm not going to detain the House very long, and there is a risk of my repeating what has been said by others, but I just wanted to say a number of things about the process. Firstly, and the technical characteristics of the bill itself, which I hope we'll return to in subsequent stages. First, in terms of the process itself, I was actually rather heartened by the discussion we had, and I'm grateful to my noble friend, the Minister on the front bench, for the discussions we had last week and for his subsequent letter about these. I think it's quite important for us to recognise, as a former member of the International Agreements Committee and following the noble Lord the Earl of Sandwich, who was also a member of that committee, we had an opportunity to report in preparation for the negotiations on the negotiating mandate, and that led, as the noble Lord Collins of Highbury rightly said, to some steps in the negotiating process that managed to deal with one or two of the problems that would otherwise have been in the document, the treaty itself. So that's rather important for us. I have to confess I have to depart from the noble Lord Collins of Highbury. I think the fact that we are not seeking to derogate from the investor-state dispute settlement provisions is a very good thing. We are a country that invests very widely and is invested in very widely. Speaking, as it were, with my Japanese friends' hat on, they invest very substantially here. They invest substantially around the world. And I think our accession to the CPTPP would have been much more difficult if we had sought to depart from ISDS provisions. And as a country, we have never been successfully challenged on an investor-state dispute settlement. But I think many British companies who invest around the world would wish us to be participating and promoting ISDS. In terms of the ratification process, of course, we've agreed we're still getting used to this after we left the European Union, and part of the structure of that is waiting for the Trade and Agriculture Commission to report. Now, on the assumption they do so in the next few weeks and the government responds relatively promptly, that should then, after a delay of maybe up to 10 days, should permit the government then to notify the accession to CRAG under the legislation and give an opportunity for the International Agreements Committee, see the chair of which in his place, that should give the International Agreements Committee what we would expect, which is an opportunity to report on the agreement, on the treaty, and to ask the House either to consider it or to have a debate, and that might reasonably be all completed before the date of the 16th of July 2024, which is 1 year after the signature, and therefore within the time frame that we've committed ourselves to complete the ratification process. So it's not easy to work out how these things work, but actually I think it's quite helpful for the House, both Houses, to decide whether they support ratification at a point where they've heard from the Trade and Agriculture Commission, where they've heard from their relevant select committees, and the House has decided whether it is happy to put the necessary domestic legislation in place. That's what this bill is about, putting the necessary domestic legislation in place. And in that respect, when we come to debate it in committee and report, particularly in committee, I hope we can explore just a very few issues. Firstly, as my noble friend knows, the provisions on procurement in Schedule 2 go wider than what is presently in the Procurement Act. Noble lords who are involved in the Procurement Act will think it wasn't really very long ago that we wrote all that stuff, and now we're having to change it. And I think we'll need to know why we're changing it and why we appear to be widening it. And I'm not concerned with the timing, because if that Act doesn't come into force till October 2024, we've already got amendments to the public contract regulations which allow it to be the necessary steps to have been taken. So I think that is a legitimate question for us to debate on this bill, because the language is different. Secondly, noble lords involved in these negotiations will be aware that with Japan and Australia, we secured commitments on their part to enable us to have geographical indicators accepted in those countries. Now, in this legislation, we are extending what is in effect geographical indicator status to other CPTPP countries. I hope this will be an opportunity for us to ensure that we are making progress in a reciprocal fashion, because geographical indicators are very important, whether it's Lincolnshire sausages or any other particular product. On the final one I want to mention is, I think, copyright. It's a difficult area, but I do think, and I hope noble lords who are perhaps more expert in this area than I am, will be able to explore why it is, again, we seem to be extending a power for ministers to enable a country to be treated as a qualifying country, which will then allow rights holders to access what's called equitable remuneration in this country, as if they were UK rights holders. Why we are doing that in this legislation in a way that appears to extend more widely than is necessary for CPTPP countries, and to do so rather more widely than has been the case in the past. So those are simply issues that I hope we will have the opportunity to turn to during committee, but I don't want any of those issues to detract from the fact that I regard the CPTPP accession and all that goes with it, and the potential that it offers, as very much to be welcomed. And I'm very glad the government has brought this legislation forward for the purpose.
So I'm very grateful to be able to speak after the list. The UK's accession to CPTPP is a golden opportunity to usher in a new era of trade relations in some of the world's more dynamic and fast-growing economies, and this bill is to be welcomed. I'd like to focus on the specialty insurance sector and refer to my interest as an employee of Marsh, as stated in the register. Without insurance, much of this trade wouldn't be able to happen. The capital which comes into the London market of specialty insurance, reinsurance, is highly international and highly mobile. About almost 70% of it is foreign-owned, and 85% of market income is earned by companies domiciled outside the UK. Now, at the advent of this new trading frontier, is the time to consider what more government, regulators and industry could do together to both access these fast-growing markets and encourage and welcome investment from these countries to the UK. The UK has a unique offer, my lords, to CPTPP nations, many of which are at heightened risk from natural disasters and other risks. We are the only market that has the concentration of capital and expertise to protect nations against existential threats to their economies and people. Our offer is not replicated anywhere else in the world. The financial regulators were given an international competitive objective within the Financial Services and Marketing Act. CPTPP membership now offers us the chance to put theory into practice, but this will only happen if the financial regulators play an active role in deepening the UK's relationship with our CPTPP partners coordinating with regulators and businesses to promote cross-border trade. What the industry would like to see is a welcome mat, described by my noble friend Lord Holmes and alluded to by the noble and learned Lord Goldsmith. A dedicated and joined-up function within government which can create a coherent and coordinated pathway, a one-stop shop for overseas investors wanting to come to the UK, set up business, create jobs and invest across the country. This is not some untried, untested ideas. Many of our closest competitors have teams who do exactly similar arrangements. The Bermuda Business Development Agency, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. My home was in Ireland originally, and Ireland's Foreign Direct Investment Agency, is making notable progress in encouraging high levels of inward investment and consequent employment, modest by maybe the UK standards, but very important to them. Business as usual is no longer good enough. Let's seize the opportunity as the first new joiner to this dynamic trading bloc, to welcome new and emerging economies to industries like the London insurance market and show them exactly why we are a world leader in risk. In closing, can I therefore ask my noble friend, the Minister, two questions? Would he comment on what discussions he's having with the UK regulators and what expectations he's setting about the role they will play within the CPTPP structures to encourage cross-border trade in financial and professional services as our relationships within the bloc deepen? And secondly, would he comment on how he will look at how we can build this welcome mat approach, as it will require cross-departmental working between his department and others?
My Lords, as my noble friend Lord Razzle alluded to, this has been a longer debate than it probably would have been had not the Secretary of State, now departed, been involved. But it's been a very interesting debate, and I dare say never have so many T's, P's and C's been used by in your Lordship's house. Most of them, I say, in the right order, so very well done, all of you. But despite the clumsy branding, this really is an important development in UK international trade. It must have been important because the noble Lord Cameron of Chipping Camden chose it for his charming, graceful... Norton, sorry, wrong. Oh, please scrub that. Please rewrite. The noble Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton chose this for his charming, graceful and amusing maiden speech, for which he's received universal plaudits, to which I add my name. It is a shame he's had to leave before the final denouement of this debate, but I'm sure he'll be beating a path to Hansard in the morning. We look forward to many opportunities to both hear from him and ask him questions going forward in your Lordship's house. My Lords, we heard from the Chair of the International Agreements Committee, of which I'm also a member, about how we should be scrutinising this treaty. And we've heard many other pleas from your Lordship's House about how we have an opportunity to have meaningful and proper scrutiny. And I would note one thing that hasn't been noted is that the change in machinery of government, to which the noble Lord Grantchester referred, has changed the select committee structure, which means that we no longer have a designated trade select committee, which further dilutes the amount of scrutiny that we're getting here. So, my Lords, this has been a proxy debate, where we've been debating the treaty without any of the proper information that we need to have. And for many of us, have been somewhat ignoring the actual substantive of the debate. And we thank Lord Lansley for belatedly pushing our nose to the grindstone while looking at the technical issues within the actual bill that we're supposed to be debating. But, my Lords, the debate we're having today about this bill is more of a debate than the Commons got on the Australian deal. That was promised and never given. So we have to take the opportunities when we get them, but we shouldn't be begging ministers and begging the government for Parliament's right to properly scrutinise this really important trade deal. But of course, turning to the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The name is an indication of the journey it has taken. With every step that it has made, another letter has been added to its acronym. But we should also note that it is uniquely a trade organisation that was designed by the United States, into which the United States is never going, or almost likely never to be, a member. But it was interesting to hear last week the US Chamber of Commerce, which is its largest business organisation, berating successive US governments for not doing trade deals. So you never know, maybe something might turn up. But I do think we should bear in mind that design hand that went into this organisation, because there are differences between a bloc with essentially US systems and processes and ourselves with essentially EU systems and processes. And I think it was very interesting to hear Lord Trees set out the gradient between those two ways of looking at standards that we see. And I believe that this is going to something that we will see more of as we go through. And I think the Earl of Sandwich also referred to those differences and disparities. So it's something I think we should be very concerned about, and if we have the opportunity to scrutinise, something we should get under the skin of. My Lords, we know that the government's projected benefits for this treaty are relatively tiny. Everybody's mentioned this. And frankly, if it was aiming to meaningfully boost trade, the government would have been better employed reversing our decline in exports to Germany, where we've fallen from number 2 to number 9. And perhaps, given the dexterity of our minister, he could even try and do both at once. But with this backdrop of really only a small nudge in trade, it's no wonder that so many of your Lordship's House have emphasised the politics and the new focus on Asia-Pacific. And I see this point, and I recognise its importance, and I think we all recognise its importance, and we look forward to further discussions on this and the implications of this politically, economically, and in security terms. But back to the case in hand. During the run-up to the accession of the Australian FTI, there was much concern regarding agriculture. There were and are still significant concerns that in order to get that deal, the UK conceded too much on animal welfare and environmental concerns. Now, as we've heard from Lord Trees and Lord Curry, there are similar concerns that UK farming standards could be compromised, indeed would be compromised, by this agreement. Additionally, UK pesticide standards could and would be undermined. I have a number of 119 pesticides that are banned in the UK that will be allowed to use in one or more CPTPP member. So, my Lords, we're back to this gradient again. We're back to the differences in the way that standards are operated in our respective organisations. Now, the Australian deal kicked off this spring, so I would ask the Minister, what have we learned so far from the Australian experience? Perhaps the Minister could set out how he sees reciprocal opportunities for British farmers, not just in Australia, of course, but in the whole of the CPTPP, and what his department and DEFRA will be doing to organise ourselves so that we can take advantage of those opportunities and get some British food on CPTPP plates. And as we've noted, many of your Lordships have noted, this is going to need a bit of export oomph. My Lords, many of us watched with admiration how Australia stood up to the Chinese when it launched politically motivated and punitive tariffs on some of their products. The Aussie response was not to launch tit-for-tat tariffs against the much bigger China. Instead, it weathered the storm by getting out and selling its products to other places, other countries. Now, China has started to withdraw those tariffs. So looking beyond agriculture, this country needs to be able to be on the front foot like Australia was when it comes to trade. And there seems, my lords, to be a lot of work to do. We've heard from a number, Lord Udney Lister and others, about what needs to be done and the inadequacy of where we are now. Because we've heard small and medium-sized companies are half the economy. They're half the economy, my lords. And when we were taking evidence from their representative, it was very clear that they do not feel they are getting the support and the help that these businesses need to get over the activation energy they need to export things. It was hard enough when Brexit happened, and indeed many small businesses have stopped exporting because they haven't even got over that barrier. But getting their products to Vietnam is a whole order of magnitude harder. And the government needs to be at least one order of magnitude, if not 2 orders of magnitude, better at giving them the help they need. So can the Minister please acknowledge that there is a huge amount of work that has to be done by his and other departments? Because if he doesn't, the export opportunities will not be taken up. And frankly, what's the point of a trade deal if you don't trade? But the risks extend beyond domestic farmers and inadequately exploiting the opportunities. First, I would point out is the treatment of workers, which was mentioned by the noble Lord Collins. And my lords, while the government is flirting with ILO violations with its strikes bill, these infractions pale to those seen in countries such as Brunei, Mexico and Vietnam. How does the government intend to deal with non-ILO compliant economies and their products? Meanwhile, my lords, there is a real danger to the UK commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that they could be undermined by the CPTPP. My lords, since Brexit, the UK has been mindful of developmentally sensitive products, including bananas, and here we're in fruit territory over there, and it has to be careful to maintain the value of trade preferences when designing unilateral trade policies, including the UK's global tariff and the recently launched Developing Country Trading Scheme. In recent bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations, however, there's been a less consistent approach. The market access schedules for bananas, and I'm using bananas as one example of such products, negotiated as part of the UK's accession to the CPTPP, included concerning concessions. As I'm sure the noble Earl opposite knows, the UK granted and reduced tariff to both Peru and Mexico and slightly lowered concessions for other CPTPP members. Whilst at present Peru and Mexico are relatively marginal suppliers to the UK market, the change threatens to set a precedent, the same point that was made earlier. If they do it for one when we're negotiating another deal, perhaps with a country that has a much stronger Central American country with a much stronger and larger banana export market, then we are undermining the market access that is provided via the economic partnership agreements and to least development countries, my lords, and this jeopardises our sustainable development goals. So I would like the Minister to really comment on how that is being addressed and what his department expects to happen in that area. My lords, the UK economy has a much larger service sector, as we've heard, than it has manufacturing, and FTAs traditionally stumble when it comes to the services part of exports and imports. So I would like the Minister to reflect a little on that, and in particular, I'd like to look at where we stand on future mutual recognition of qualifications, because services is really driven by things like mutual recognition of qualifications. So it would be good if the Minister can explain where we are. Will that be dealt with through CPTPP, or will there need to be bilateral or other ways of actually delivering that? Another way that services work is through short-term visits by our professionals into those territories. It's not 100% clear to me where we are on visas for short-term visas to facilitate that kind of work. And finally, on data localisation, the Lord Lansley set out some issues on that, and I think some idea of how far we can take this is very important, because that will be the blood that makes services flow through the system. My lords, my noble friends, Lord Razzle and Lord Foster, set out really important concerns regarding IP and GI sections of this bill. And I do hope the Minister has been listening and takes on board the concerns that we have here. The noble Lord Lansley is also correct that in procurement we spent a lot of time talking about procurement. Indeed, we suffered more amendments from a government than I think has ever happened before in order to do this. And yet, straight away, the government is turning its back on some of what we decided. That's not unique, by the way. In the Swiss, the negotiations of the Swiss free trade agreement for mutual recognition of qualifications, it also turns its back on aspects of the professional qualifications bill that we also worked on. So there is a disconnect along the line here sometimes, that we spend many hours scrutinising legislation and then a bunch of trade negotiators go off and ignore them. So why and how is this allowed to happen? So there is a bigger question as well as the individual question that the noble Lord Lansley raised. My lords, I look at the time and I've already talked for too long, so I will sit down. But I look forward to the Minister's response to this debate, and I look forward to the committee stage. But most of all, my lords, I look forward to us having a meaningful scrutiny of this treaty.
My lords, it's the detail. It's always the detail. And this afternoon we've had many thoughtful and detailed contributions, to which I thank your lordships. So let's have a look at the detail. But before I start, let me first welcome the new Foreign Secretary to his place, or maybe not to his place, but we do understand why he's not with us for these closing remarks. My only interaction with the new Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton was through NCS, the National Citizen Service, which he set up when Prime Minister. I had the privilege of replacing my noble friend Lord Blunkett on the NCS board and working with that board, its chair Brett Wigdort's CEO and the staff to deliver many fantastic programmes and opportunities for young people across the country. NCS worked and continues to do so, and I wish it all the best. Now, turning to the Trade Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. As Nick Thomas-Symonds, MP, our then Shadow Trade Minister, said when debating CPTPP last year, we on the Labour benches are pro-trade, pro-business and pro-worker. Accessing new markets is essential and is particularly welcome because of many of the government's failures. The Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, forecasts that UK exports were due to fall by over 6% last year, which amounted to more than a £51 billion hit to the UK economy. So not a great starting point when on the government's own measures, as we've heard, the economic benefits of joining CPTPP are negligible, adding a projected £2 billion or less than 0.08% to the UK GDPs over the next 10 years. So no wonder, and rightly, we have concentrated on some of the political benefits which we share. So no amount of minor trade agreements will make up for this government's economic mismanagement. In saying that, like many across the House, I welcome the economic ties with Canada, East Asia and the Pacific. And in line with Lord Lamont's comments earlier, it is vital that the UK play a role in ensuring that development in one of the fastest growing regions in the world benefits British business, British consumers and British workers. Lowering the barriers to trade is good news, but there is a balance to be struck, and we've heard some of that across the House. So hearing from business organisations, it's clear that CPTPP membership will bring some noticeable improvements, particularly around digital trade and rules of origin manufacturers. I also welcome the opportunity to speak today, but of course I'm conscious of the fact that what we are discussing here in this bill is not the agreement itself, but rather a handful of changes in domestic law to facilitate what has already been signed up to by the government. And I join my noble friend Lord Goldsmith in calling for a full debate across your Lordship's House. It seems clear to me that in this day and age, Parliament needs and deserves a greater role in structuring, in scrutinising and ratifying trade deals. A number of the clauses in the bill pertain to the devolved administrations, and it's always a bit strange winding up trying to find something new. I don't think we've had many questions about the devolved administrations, so possibly something new for the Minister. So can I ask what engagement his department has had with both the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Government? What stage are we at with seeking legislative consent from the devolved authorities? Are we seeking concurrent powers, and is His Majesty's Government listening and responding to any of the devolved authorities' concerns? Without such powers for all the parliaments of the UK, trade will remain reserved for those members of the Cabinet. And as we've seen in recent years, too often trade policy has been dictated by Conservative leadership hopefuls looking for a quick but ultimately unsubstantive win. Just look at the free trade agreements with New Zealand and Australia, which predated this. It's our farmers in a decade's time who will be suffering as a result of the hastily negotiated FTA. And I use negotiated in the loosest possible sense. And it was at these very dispatch boxes where we were told, when discussing the FTAs with New Zealand and Australia, not to worry, that there would be no detriment to British farmers or to our manufacturers. Patently now untrue. So, while the Tories are looking for the headlines, we need to look at the detail, and that is one of the things that your Lordship's House is particularly good at, going through that fine print. And what do we find there? In most of the areas, CPTPP membership does not in itself represent an improvement on the pre-existing bilateral deals. And multiple organisations have pointed to potential issues with regards to the environment, food standards and workers' rights. So let me take them in order. With regard to the environment, the government's own DBT and Department of Business and Trade impact assessment on page 79 says, deforestation in CPTPP countries where it occurs has been driven by the production of commodities such as cattle, timber and palm oil. The majority of CPTPP members are not considered to be at risk of deforestation, except Malaysia, which has experienced a 29% reduction in tree cover over the last 20 years. This has been driven by agricultural commodities, which account for 93% of Malaysia's tree cover loss since 2001, implying that international trade plays a key role in the country's deforestation. So can I therefore ask the noble Lord the Minister, what protections are being put in place to ensure that Malaysia's deforestation is not exacerbated? Like many civil society organisations, environmental groups and trade unions, I also have concerns over the signing up to the outdated ISDS mechanisms, and that the government have thus far wisely avoided in most of the free trade agreements. We must ensure that the right to regulate in the public interest for the sake of environmental protections, food standards and workers' rights is protected by excluding ISDS terms through side letters. May I suggest that it's not too late, as the Secretary of State himself seems to argue a few months ago to seek similar agreements with countries like Canada. British businesses will surely be asking if the government can cut the red tape on imports from Brunei, why can't it cut the red tape that is strangling many of the SMEs in their exports or their attempted exports to the European Union? So turning to workers' rights and the ILO standards, many unions globally have expressed concerns that the CPTPP has no effective mechanism to enforce fundamental ILO standards. So can I ask the Noble Lord, the Minister, if he could share with your Lordships, is there a mechanism, and if so, what they are, as a number of the CPTPP members as we've heard, widespread labour rights abuses violating ILO conventions on freedom of association and collective bargaining. As Lord Trees said, it is not our standards or our protections that are the issue. It is the protections and the standards of other countries and them being used to undermine and undercut businesses within the UK. What we need is a consistent and thought-through approach to reassure the public and companies, both here and abroad, that we are truly a nation open for business. As my friend, the Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Trade, said last week, the next Labour government will finally publish the trade white paper that this government has failed to do so. One that both business will have shaped so that they can have confidence when exploring new markets, and crucially, that strategy will be connected to our industrial and to our foreign objectives. My Lords, what we need is a government with an industrial strategy that not only lowers the barriers to trade worldwide, but supports and facilitates British companies and their desire to export abroad. Much of Lord Livingston of Parkhead's comments I disagree with, but a number of the points he made hit right on the head. We need to be supporting more trade shows. Our government need to be supporting, through the Department of Business and Trade, our manufacturing abroad. We need to take advantage of these trade deals and the accessions, but that needs to come, as he rightly said, from the support from the Department. Whilst, and I'll finish on this, we're discussing trade, I'd just like to put one other myth to bed. The government has argued that the non-binding memorandums of understanding which have been signed with American individual states are some kind of Brexit benefit. This is patently not true. They could have been signed anyway. But as the FT trade editor Alan Beattie wrote last week, and I quote, "Mind you, when it comes to signing pointless pieces of papers, there are few countries to touch the UK. Conservative ministers love agreeing non-binding MOUs with individual US states and pretending that they are some Brexit dividend." He continues, "They aren't." So, my Lords, with that, I welcome the new Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton and look forward to the Minister's response.
I thank the Noble Lord for the segue into my closing address, and it is an enormous pleasure to reply to conclude this debate. Before I do that, though, I would like to draw members' attention to my entries in the Register of Members' Interests. I do have investments in companies that operate in CPTPP member countries, but as often in these debates, I do not believe they represent a conflict given the nature of this bill. And I would like to join the very long line of peers who complimented the opening and maiden speech made by my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton. I too believe that I thought at one point, Noble Lords, that it was the popularity of my enthusiasm for free trade that encouraged so many people to sign up to speak in this debate. And only later did I realise that I'd actually delegated, as was heard earlier, the opening to the newest member of the House, for which I'm extremely proud. And I would like to reinforce my own message that to have Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton on these benches, and in fact in this House, is an enormous testament to the importance of this chamber. And he is an individual, I think we all believe strongly, is absolutely the right person to take forward our foreign policy agenda at such a perilous time in the state of the world that we see, and such an important time for the United Kingdom. And I'm very proud to have sat next door to him during this debate. He also, I hope you realise, took the debate extremely seriously and dedicated almost the entirety of this debate, given the other pressures on him relating to the state visit from the President of Korea, for which I know he would want me to ensure that there was some element of recognition around the seriousness with which we take this important debate around CPTPP. I would also like to praise and pass thanks on to the IAC, which I believe to be one of the most important, and certainly as far as I'm concerned, important entities in this House in ensuring that we reach strong conclusions as we prosecute our post-Brexit vision of Britain through our free trade agreements. And the interlocution with the Noble Lord, Lord Goldsmith, has been particularly valuable for me over the past few weeks. I welcome him back to his usual place as chairman of this committee. And of course it would be remiss of me not to pay homage to Baroness Hayter, who has been a very powerful representative of independent-minded peers in this House in terms of ensuring that the government is held to strong account when it comes to talking about our trade ambitions. And I'm extremely grateful to her that she remains highly active in this area. We've heard also today a number of extremely insightful points raised by many peers. I think, from my point of view, listening to this debate, I am heartened at the seriousness with which we take this important subject and the key points that people wish to raise. And I will try to respond to as many of them as possible. It is a very long list. This debate, at the time it's taken us to discuss the second reading, would have taken me to fly to most of the countries in CPTPP. But I do believe that free trade genuinely gives us longer, happier and wealthier lives. So just through this debate on such an important subject, our lives have been extended and we have become personally richer. But if I haven't covered everyone's comments, then please do know that I will inspect the Hansard account of this important debate afterwards and ensure that members of this House are written to specifically. And I think, as a number of members of this House have mentioned, there is a sensible and lengthy journey around this process, which will also include, and I will come on to this, proper scrutiny of the CPTPP treaty itself. So if I may just start by talking briefly about some of the benefits of this treaty, which I think can get lost in the details. And I'm particularly grateful for Lord Vasey of Didcot, who many members will know as a celebrity on the radio, but I know as an important advocate of free trade. And I think that some of the points that he raised in terms of the specificity and some of the specifics, which often get lost in the detail, are extremely valuable in terms of business mobility, in terms of the ability to trade, in terms of the ability to increase our exports and also our imports. And from my point of view as Investment Minister, the essential nature of bringing in more investment to the United Kingdom. And I may say, if I can, and this country is not a member of CPTPP, but today alone we announced, in conjunction with the President of Korea's visit to this great nation, over £20 billion of investment into the UK. This is the value of trade writ large in pounds sterling. And imagine what we can do with countries where we have an even closer relationship through a treaty such as this. I think one of the points that has been raised by a number of noble peers in this House, Lord Lansley, Lord Howell, Lord Lamont particularly, and Lord Udine Lister, the strategic importance of our membership of the CPTPP, which gives us this vital, absolutely crucial presence in the Indo-Pacific region, strategically, economically, philosophically, culturally, and for reasons of alignment through defence. This is not simply a pounds, shillings and pence trade agreement. This is an essential component of how we as a nation wish to define ourselves when it comes to ensuring our security and wealth creation into the future. And I was very glad that so many members, even members of this House who had rightly specific issues to raise in terms of the specificity of the CPTPP, are fundamentally behind this crucial mission of this trading nation that is the United Kingdom. And fundamentally, the positive comments from noble peers across the House, I find it extremely heartening. I would also like, if I may, to bring to bear some of the comments that we've had from businesses and representative groups across the country. I will go on to touch on some of the consultations that we engaged in, and I'm very aware of the comments made by members across this House about the importance of promoting both consultation as we go into the trade deal and the importance of promoting the benefits of the trade deal as we come out. We have in this instance consulted widely and extensively, and the feedback we've had has been overwhelmingly positive. Minette Batters, the celebrated president of the NFU, has said that the government continues to maintain its commitment to our food safety standards, something that I'd like you to bear in mind as I touch on that subject later on. Adding, the UK has achieved a balanced outcome, particularly with respect to managing market access in our most vulnerable sectors. This is very important. I hope that all members of the House hear those important points from the President of the NFU. William Bain, a former member of the other place and now at the British Chamber of Commerce, said the agreement was good news for UK business and offered new prospects in a fast-growing region. And the Federation of Small Businesses, which the Earl of Effingham was right to point out as an absolutely essential component of all our trade deals, said they are very pleased to see the UK officially join the CPTPP trade agreement. I would now like to, if I may, turn to some of the specific points raised. I will go through these relatively quickly, but please do feel free to intervene if I miss a point. I'm sure you will, I'm sure noble lords will, and of course, as I said, there are some instances where I will be obliged to write you with further information. Just breaking ourselves down into components, on the issues of technical barriers to trade, a number of noble lords have raised questions and actually support. Lord Udine Lister, I was particularly grateful for your support, as I was from the Lord Frost as well, and Baroness Lawlor as well. This is important for us because it will enable us to certify conformity assessment bodies in CPTPP countries that they can perform the relevant checks, which will enable for trade to flow more efficiently. I've looked into this personally in some depth. I don't see there being an issue. I think Lord Grantchester raised a particular point around this. These are reciprocal, so it enables us to have our conformity assessment bodies assessed by CPTPP members. It is common practice, and I would like to just stress CABs established in CPTPP parties do not receive automatic approval in the UK. They have to be assessed. All this really does, noble lords, is enable us to rightly ensure that CABs can be properly accredited by CABs in the UK. And I really do not personally see any issue other than something that is positive around that. We touched on government procurement. I'm very comfortable discussing further any specifics. I think Lord Lansley particularly has raised some very pertinent points, and I hope I answered those in my letter to my noble friend. I'm sure that letter has been lodged in the library for everyone to read. If not, be delighted to circulate that to interested peers. Ultimately, yes, I do agree that bringing in some of the procurement changes when we are going to be introducing them in the Procurement Act, which comes into force next October, in order that we can comply with our July the 17th obligations under CPTPP, does seem a bit unnecessary. I mean, it isn't unnecessary, noble lords, but it is extremely necessary for us to comply. But clearly, it is not a specific or sort of seismic issue. But as I said, unfortunately, we are obliged to fulfil the requirements of our obligations. When I look at intellectual property, it's important that the CPTPP provisions commit parties to a minimum level of IP standards. This is not uncommon in plurilateral trade agreements, which often seek to set a baseline on which parties can build, and the UK's accession to CPTPP will not limit our ability to seek more ambitious trade agreements with others, including those that are CPTPP members. And we intend to be a very constructive member and to champion our values and priorities, particularly through the committees and councils set up by the agreement. A question was raised on generic medicines to the UK market, and just to be reassured, noble lords across the House, there will be no delays to the entry of generic medicines to the UK market as a result of the UK joining CPTPP, and no increase in the cost the NHS pays for medicines. We have not made any domestic changes to our rules regarding the marketing of generic medicines, and we are committed to ensuring patient access to medicines and affordable medicine prices for the NHS, while also supporting the UK's world-class life sciences sector. And our future trade agreement will not change this. I believe Lord Foster asked a question around grace periods, and the UK has signed up to the IP provisions in CPTPP, which is required of all members. We've agreed with CPTPP parties that the UK will comply with Article 1838 on grace periods only once the necessary amendments to the European Patent Convention and Strasbourg Patent Convention have been made in line with Article 18.38 of the CPTPP and not before. So there is a process that we are going through in this point to make sure that all the necessary grace periods relating to IP provisions are aligned. Lord Razzle, the noble Lord, raised some justifiable points around the principles of copyright, as did Lord Holmes, who I can reassure when he asked whether or not there are reciprocal rights for our artists in CPTPP countries. Absolutely there are. This is the whole point of signing up to this trade agreement. This is the free trade area rather than the country-specific free trade zone. So the reciprocity of the membership is entitled fundamentally to all the members. So I'm extremely keen to promote that. However, there will be a change in the artists' rights paid to performances broadcast over media in the UK, not over the internet. And we are applying this to all countries who sign up to these measures in the World Trade Organization. However, as has been rightly raised by Lord Razzle, we are embarking on a consultation which will enable us to ensure that we set the right level of protection for our music industry and for our artists. But fundamentally, the idea of giving our artists half their royalties, as we do for UK and many other countries' broadcast artists in this country, strikes me as a very fair and equitable thing to do, and very much part of the spirit of the agreement. However, the consultation will inform us appropriately whether we have that right, and I'm looking forward to that being reviewed. I would like to turn briefly to geographical indications. I think Baroness Hayter raised this, as did a number of noble lords in this House. What this allows us to do, it allows the Secretary of State to cancel future geographical indicators, not current ones that are already in existence, if it is felt that they are confusing or not appropriate. It's important to note that for the EU, as part of our withdrawal agreement, we can't cancel geographical indicators, and so any relationship between geographical indicators and other CPTP members will be direct rather than through us. So I hope that you will be reassured by that. If I turn to the important point of parliamentary scrutiny in the 2 minutes or so I have left, I totally agree with noble lords' views. We must have a good debate around both the bill, which contains relatively specific technical provisions, and the essence of the CPTPP, which is such a wonderful thing. And I look forward to having these debates with you. And it is not unusual for the CRAG process to run in parallel to the bill. They are two different things, as Lord Goldsmith will be aware. They are two completely different things in the essence of parliamentary activity, and I've made it very clear to Lord Carr, to Lord Trees, to Lord Foster, to Lord Grantchester, to Lord Sandwich that the importance of a strong, open and wide-ranging general debate on an FTA is right, and I abide by the Grimstone principle, my formidable predecessor, whose immortality is secured by having a principle named after him. It's my own ambition to also try and work one into our future trade debates to ensure that there is, as I say, a general debate. I think there's a process, noble lords, that we have to go through where that's requested, and I'd be delighted, obviously, to respond positively to that. I'm also extremely available to noble Lord Goldsmith and his committees, and indeed any noble lord who wishes to spend time with myself or the officials of my department going through the intricacies of this bill. And we wait for the report from the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which I'm told will come soon, and it will certainly come before the end, before the next part of this piece. Just to cover a few brief other final points, because quite rightly the screen is flashing at me. Lord McNichol touched on devolution, the one area that hadn't been covered. I'm very pleased to say that we are not trying to run concurrent powers through this bill. We are looking for legislative consent motions. I have written to both the trade ministers of Wales and of Scotland, and look forward to having strong interlocution with them, but the feedback I've had from my officials so far has been extremely positive, and I welcome that. And there is no doubt that the benefits to Wales and to Scotland for this deal is enormous. Scottish whisky alone is worth over $1 billion, and with Malaysian opportunities, seeing import tariffs cut by from 80% down to zero will be significant. That is just one commodity item in itself. If I may briefly touch on the agricultural side before I come to a conclusion. This is very important and clearly will be the subject of a great deal of the debate in the coming sections of this important discussion. It's very, very essential to understand one key point. There is no derogation of our standards on account of signing up to the CPTPP. We've also introduced a number of very clear tariff rate quota mechanisms to ensure that we are protecting our industries from excessive levels of import. And I would reassure noble lords in this instance that actual imports of beef, poultry, eggs and sheep meat from the non-Australia, New Zealand CPTPP countries is extremely low in terms of the pressures on our own agricultural sector. In fact, we haven't imported an egg, for example, from Mexico since 2015. And that is important to stress. It's a sensational statistic that I picked up this morning, and I was very keen to get into the debate. My knowledge of... I should rephrase that. We haven't imported a hard shell egg in its entirety, because we do import egg powder from Mexico, as noble lords will know. I would like to now turn to my final point. Before, as I come to a conclusion, there's two final points I'd like to cover briefly on China. It's very important in relation to China that we are clear, as are all CPTPP members, that the decisions are taken by consensus. Applicant economies must be willing and able to meet the high standards of the agreement, demonstrate a pattern of complying with their existing trade commitments, and be able to command consensus. And importantly, further to this, we will be joining CPTPP first, so that we will be on the inside judging other applications, not vice versa. And entry into force of the accession protocol will permit us to be a party to the CPTPP, which is why it's so crucial we ratify this agreement and become a party. And one last piece, if I may be indulged by the House, on investor-state dispute settlements. I was extremely grateful to Lord Livingston for the support, for the vocal support, and Lord Lansley for the vocal support of these principles, in the sense that from my historic experience running investments in many of these countries, the investor-state dispute mechanisms are very important for allowing British businesses to invest safely and build in these economies. And we feel, from the UK side, very protected by the fact that we run and operate a strong degree of rule of law, and as a result of which are protected by our own systems. And so I would not be keen to see us derogate our responsibilities and links to investor-state dispute settlements, because I think they are actually important. And in this instance, they will represent strong protections for our companies operating in CPTPP and will result in more investment both ways. So, my lords, to conclude, this bill represents the continuation of our policy of expanding our horizons to the four corners of the world, being party to the crucial liberalisation of trade, which has played such an important part in the economic well-being of our citizens and is an essential component of our strategy to truly immerse ourselves amongst the faster-growing economies of the Asia-Pacific regions. As William Seward said in 1852, this is my favourite quote, noble lords, "The Pacific Ocean, its shores, its islands, and the vast regions beyond will become the chief theatre of events in the world's great hereafter." He was correct, and I celebrate this new opportunity afforded us by our fellow nations in the CPTPP to join them in this new stage of development. And we should be grateful to them, by the way, particularly countries such as Japan, who led such an important campaign to encourage us to exceed, but all the countries of the CPTPP. The Secretary of State for Business and Trade has stated, as CPTPP's first ever member and the only European member, we are linking the UK to some of the world's most dynamic economies, giving British businesses first mover advantage in some of the fast-growing markets of the world, supporting jobs and economic growth right across the country. And I would, as I come to a conclusion, like to thank the former Secretary of State, Dr. Liam Fox, who started these negotiations, Elizabeth Truss, my previous Secretary of State, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Kemi Badenoch, my current Secretary of State, and all the civil servants and officials who've been so hard-working in this process. So this is an issue that transcends party politics. It is intrinsic to our way of life and our prosperity, not just here in the UK, but across the world. And I commend the bill to the House.
The question is, this bill be now read a second time? As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. Contrary not content, the contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
I think the Minister should be moving a commitment motion.
I beg to move the other motion standing in my name on the order paper. Is that? The question. So the bill be committed to a grand committee, and for the order in which the clauses and schedule will be taken, will then be put and decided. Is that correct? Have I said that correctly? Why have I been given one?
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content, the contents have it.
We'll see you all at Grand Committee. I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.